Really excited to introduce our speaker. Ironically enough, as I was driving up here in my Ford F-150 truck, I evidently cut Chuck Long off, and as we got out of our vehicles, he mentioned, I wondered who was driving that big pickup truck. I realized I had ordered or organized and helped get the speaker for clean energy and sustainable energy today. Perhaps it's cognitive dissonance or oxymoron, I don't know. But I'm really excited to have Doug here. I happened to hear him speak at a program in Harrisburg about a month or two ago. Fantastic, loved it. So without further ado, I want to read a little bit about him and then introduce you to him. Since he sold an electronics business in 2005, Doug Neidich has been very involved in renewable energy technology. As CEO of GreenWorks Development, LLC in Harrisburg, he's involved in commercial solar development, and as president of Solarity, LLC, he's involved in the development of nanotechnology-based solar cells. Doug's here today to talk about the challenges in the solar industry over the last several years and explain why solar power makes absolute financial sense in Pennsylvania right now. He'll discuss changes in the technology, the dramatic reduction in cost, and the reasons why right now is the time to launch a solar project for nonprofit entities like schools, municipalities, and hospitals, and for-profit businesses as well. He really believes that education and information about clean energy is incredibly important for students, for business leaders, and for the community as a whole. So, without further ado, Doug Neidich, turn it over to you.
Matt, thank you, and thank you everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Like Matt just mentioned, I am very interested in talking to you about why solar makes financial sense in 2020. There are a lot of different ways to look at the issue of solar energy. You can look at it from a financial standpoint, you can look at it from an environmental standpoint, you can talk about climate change, you can talk about politics, you can talk about all sorts of different ways to look at energy. It is a pretty charged topic. I specifically want to talk about the fact that solar makes financial sense in Pennsylvania right now. I'm going to limit my conversation to that, except for one quick thing. I wanted to make sure that everyone in the room was aware that you as a group, as Rotarians, are already talking about some of the other ways of looking at this issue. I took this from the April of 2019 issue of the Rotarian. That is, I think, almost exclusively dedicated to the climate change conversation. And there's an interview with Barry Rassin, your president, in the issue. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to go back. It's online, dig this back up. One of the questions that really struck me was when the interviewer asked why Rotary is uniquely able to have an impact. And Barry's answer's on the screen. He said our strengths are that we are in 200-some countries and geographic areas around the world. Our members are people who are connected to the right people. Those connections are important. You look at our polio eradication program, it's successful not because we've provided vaccines, it's because Rotarians were able to talk to the right people, to give the right support, to do the right thing. If we did that with the environment, governments would listen to us. He's absolutely on target. It's groups like these that are international groups that are connected to the community that can have huge impacts on issues like this. And clean energy is a huge issue in 2020. Here's the first thing I like to tell everyone about solar when I talk to different groups about solar energy, that every hour the amount of energy that hits the planet is about the same as the planet uses in a year. Every hour, the amount of energy that hits the planet is about the same as the planet uses in a year. That means that by the time our 1 hour long meeting is done today, you guys are really good at holding 1 hour long meetings, I know that, and I'm going to try to be as brief as I can. By the time our 1 hour long meeting is done today, the energy that hit the planet in this hour is about the same as every building that's heated and cooled, every cell phone message that's sent, every cat video that's stored, every Ford 150 truck that's on the highway. All of that energy that we use as a planet, 7.5 billion people's energy, hits the planet every hour. We are squandering our future for lack of taking advantage of the energy that's hitting us all the time. Here's basically how solar works. The left-hand graphic shows you how a solar cell itself works. Solar cells are solid-state devices. The piece of magic that's in this thing that each one of you's got on your person right now. I guarantee each one of you's got this on your person. The semiconductor material that's in a cell phone is the same semiconductor material that turns sunlight into electricity. The semiconductor material, basically, when sunlight hits a semiconductor material, it energizes the material in that semiconductor. It throws free electrons, it holds the positive and negative pairs. You collect those to an upper and a lower electrode. When you collect all the positives to one side, all the negatives to another side, that creates a work loop, that creates electricity, and that's how it works. There are no moving parts to a solar panel as a result of that. These things are incredibly reliable. They're 30-year warranties that are put on all the panels that we use. So the technology is really, really reliable and fundamentally sound. When you take those panels and you put them on either a roof or on a ground array, two of the main ways to do this, you tie them all together electrically. The graphic on the right shows a red line running down the side of the building. That's the wiring coming off of the array. It runs into an inverter. An inverter is a device that turns DC electricity that solar panels create into AC electricity that's usable. That inverter then takes the electricity and runs it into a bidirectional meter. That meter will run either forward or backward. If you're producing electricity in the middle of the day that you're not able to use at that point in time, you push that electricity off to the grid, and you're able to, in Pennsylvania, as a net metering state, able to buy and sell that electricity at the same cost. When you sell it to the grid, you're selling it at the same cost that you're buying it from the grid for. That's called net metering, so the grid is, in essence, your battery. When you don't need it, you push it off to the grid, you store it. When you need it, you bring it back in from the grid. Basically, that bidirectional meter pushes things off to the grid then. That's how a solar system works. It is fundamentally really simple stuff, and it's developed to the point in which the costs are about as low in 2020 as they're ever going to get. We're buying solar panels at this point for about 36 cents a watt. In 1975, the year I got out of high school, solar was $101 a watt. In 2020, we are buying solar panels for 36 cents a watt. That is an incredible decrease. How solar work financially? So here's why solar works in Pennsylvania right now. When you put up a solar array, if you spend $1 million in 2020 on a solar array, you'll be eligible for a 26% federal tax credit. So you put $1 million into a solar array. If you were a for-profit business, we'd encourage you to put a 25% leveraged investment into that. But for that $1 million array, you'd get a 26% federal tax credit, which means you get a tax credit of $260,000 year one for putting that array up. That's huge. Last year, that federal tax incentive was 30%. Next year, if things don't change politically, that goes down to 22%. The year following, it goes down to 10% for commercial solar arrays. Right now, if you do it this year, that's a 26% federal tax credit. So that's a huge piece of the game. You use that federal tax credit, and there's also accelerated depreciation involved, but I don't want to get too far into the details, to set up the array. Once you've set up the array, you've now got your own power generating plant, whether you're a school or a hospital or a business or a not-for-profit entity, you've got your own power generating plant, so it's like you have a coal plant sitting somewhere, except you've got a clean energy plant on site. When you've got that clean energy plant up and running on your roof or on the ground next to you, you'll save on your electricity, and that's about 7 cents per kilowatt hour, roughly, we offset in Pennsylvania. More significantly, you'll also get what's called solar renewable energy certificates, and those are green certificates that you're awarded for every 1,000 kilowatt hours of solar generated electricity that you produce. So when you produce 1,000 kilowatt hours of solar generated electricity, you get a green certificate, and that green certificate is tradable on a market in Pennsylvania that's a supply and demand based market. Utilities in Pennsylvania, because of a renewable portfolio standard that the Pennsylvania government has set up, utilities are required to either produce a certain percentage, right now in Pennsylvania it's 0.5% as the slide shows, produce a certain percentage of their electricity via solar, or buy that green energy production from people who do. That's what creates the market. If those utilities don't purchase enough of those green certificates, they don't tend to produce the electricity themselves for different reasons. If they don't produce enough of these renewable energy certificates over the course of a year, the penalty for not purchasing them is about twice the value of the certificates themselves, so they purchase them. When you've got that kind of a market set up, that sets a demand up for renewable energy certificates. Pennsylvania, 2 years ago, closed its borders to out-of-state solar generation. Pennsylvania had an open border system. It was the only state in the union that had a renewable energy certificate program that had an open border situation. You could ship solar generated electricity in from out of state, and in fact 2 years ago 70% of Pennsylvania's solar generation came from utility scale solar arrays in North Carolina. That was Pennsylvania putting money in briefcases and shipping it down south to North Carolina, which is politically kind of silly. We got the borders closed to out-of-state solar generation 2 years ago. The value of these certificates over the last 2 years has gone from ½ cent per kilowatt hour, which is really, really minuscule, up now to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So when you generate a kilowatt hour of solar generated electricity, you wind up with energy savings of about 7 cents. But you wind up with SREC value, solar renewable energy certificate value, of an additional 5 cents, which means I've got 12 cents per kilowatt hour that I can use to make sense out of your solar investment. That's where electricity, solar generated electricity, makes sense in Pennsylvania right now. You've got a 26% federal tax credit that lines up with electricity savings and that solar renewable energy certificate value. When you add that up, discount the 26% off the top, solar makes absolute financial sense in Pennsylvania right now. That's big. Again, that 26% federal tax credit is going to go down to 22 next year. It's going to step down to 10 the year following, depending on what happens with the federal election this year. I'm watching this one like a hawk, right? Pennsylvania right now requires a ½ % solar by 2021. That's the Pennsylvania legislation. If you go just east of here to New Jersey, instead of a ½ % generation that's required, New Jersey requires 5.1% by 2021. That's 10 times Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's got legislation in play to try to get up to that 5% right now, and I'm working on that right now to try to get that legislation pushed forward. The upshot of New Jersey's legislation is that in Pennsylvania, instead of these certificates being worth 5 cents per kilowatt hour, in New Jersey, they're currently worth about 24 cents a kilowatt hour. If you put 24 cents a kilowatt hour on top of 7 cents of electricity savings in Pennsylvania, in Jersey it's more like 10 or 11 cents, it's more expensive. Pennsylvania's a gas state, so we're a little bit cheaper energy. If you put 22 or 23 or 24 cents on top of 11 or 12 cents in New Jersey, instead of Pennsylvania's 7 cents plus 5 cents, in New Jersey, solar's wild alive. And the way this works is that if that electricity or energy cost in any given state is a measure of economic competitiveness, if Pennsylvania doesn't keep pace with neighboring states, that's an economic competitiveness issue over the longer term. Types of different ways to put solar on in a business or in a not-for-profit. You can do roof mount. The upper picture there is a GreenWorks Development building in Midtown Harrisburg. I'm doing a lot of real estate redevelopment in Midtown Harrisburg, trying to make sense out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We put an initial array, and you can see that initial array right here. We put an array up when we built the building 10 years ago in 2008. That was a 42 kW array, 42,000 watts of power that I put on the roof in 2008. That 42 kW array cost me $392,000 to put on the roof. 2 months ago, when Matt came up to hear me talk about this project 2 months ago, we added this additional, you can see the difference between current technology and older technology. It's a lot more dense. We put an additional 48 kW versus the 42 kW 10 years ago. We put 48 kW up 2 months ago. That 48 kW cost me $92,000 versus $392,000 10 years ago to put less energy up. That's huge. We've gotten to a point now in which the cost curve for solar has come down significantly even over the last 10 years. And it's gotten down to a point where it's pretty much dead flat. When you're buying at 36 cents per watt, which I am right now, it doesn't get much cheaper than that. So it's not a situation in which you want to wait for 5 or 10 years for cheaper technology to be available. It's about as cheap as it's going to get right now, and the incentives federally and state-wise are all lined up. That's a great situation, and that's why I wanted to come down and talk to you today. There's Commonwealth Charter Academy in the lower picture in Harrisburg. They're the second largest cyber in Pennsylvania. They just redid this building to move their headquarters in. They wanted to put solar on the roof. We put about 400 kW of solar on the roof for them. Does about 30% of their electricity, and it has worked out financially phenomenally well. So roof mount's one way to do solar, ground mount's another way to do solar. We do a lot of ground mount installations. This is basically just taking acreage, driving posts into the ground, putting a racking system on those posts, and putting the panels on there. Here's Masonic Village in Elizabethtown. It's a 3 megawatt array. It's the largest for a retirement community in the world. They initially put up a megawatt of solar about 5 or 6 years ago. That megawatt of solar that they put up performed so well financially that they called us about 3 years ago to say, come back down, we've got more land, we've got more electricity need, we want you to put another 2 megawatts up, which is what we did. Another way to do this is parking canopies. You can put solar on structures that sit over the top of parking spaces. Parking canopies are phenomenal, not only because they're kind of cool looking if you look at the slides, but because they'll keep what's called heat island effect out of the picture. If you've got a building that's sitting in the middle of a big old ocean of black macadam that's a parking lot, that black macadam absorbs a lot of energy from the sun. It re-radiates that energy into the building, and you wind up spending a lot of money pulling that energy, that heat back out of the building. If you put parking canopies up over the parking lot, not only are you generating electricity, but it's shading the parking lot and eliminating that heat island effect. And you put lights under that parking lot that are powered by the array itself. You can put charging stations under there. This is Las Vegas, Nevada. They just put a V3 supercharging plaza in place right behind Harrah's on the Strip in Las Vegas. My son lives out there, so I know this area really well. These are bifacial panels. They collect sunlight from the top and the bottom of the panel. Those guys are basically powering these charging stations. These are V3 chargers that have the capacity to charge 1,000 miles of range of an electric car in an hour, which is really pretty cool stuff. If you can charge 1,000 miles of range in an hour, I'm getting to the point where I can just put gas in my car and keep going. Great technology, and solar's completely tied into that. You can't do those in Pennsylvania at this point because that 5 cents for SRECs per kilowatt hour plus 7 cents in Pennsylvania adds up to 12 cents. If you go to Jersey or you go to California or you go to Massachusetts, you'll see these things all over the place. Silicon Valley, parking lots have parking canopies all over the place. That's the kind of situation that we could start to make happen in Pennsylvania if Pennsylvania's legislature gets its act together and increases its demand for solar-generated electricity to keep pace with neighboring states. Here's the last way to put solar up is to do floating solar. This is a and I should have mentioned earlier, GreenWorks Development is partnered with a company in Mechanicsburg, right outside of Harrisburg, called Solar Renewable Energy. Solar Renewable Energy is run by Doug Barry. He's my business partner. He's a CPA. I'm the engineer. CPAs are really handy to have involved in solar projects because I've come to say that solar's not a technology business. The technology's pretty standard. It's been around since 1954. Solar is a tax accounting and finance business. So a CPA, for me, doing solar work is a really handy guy to have. This is a floating array that we just finished about 6 months ago in Saraville, New Jersey. It's for the Saraville Water Authority. They had a 17-acre pond that they had built years ago. It's a man-made pond. They bring water in off the river. They let the sediments and the heavier stuff settle out of the water when they bring it in off the river, and then they pull water off the top of the pond in order to treat it and supply it to the neighboring area. They recognized an opportunity that they had 17 acres of water that was sitting there that was growing algae and doing all the things that happens in water when it just sits there still and sunlight hits it. They put out a bid to 12 or 14 different companies to have companies take a look at what it would take to come in and do a floating array on that 17 acres. 6 months ago, we finished an 11-acre, 4.4 megawatt floating array in New Jersey. That is the largest in the U.S. We're working on one that's about twice that big at this point in New Jersey again, because you couldn't do this in Pennsylvania. You can't afford it. The one that we're working on now that's about twice as big as this one is going to be the largest in the world. Pretty cool stuff. We build a build a dock. This is a big project. We build a dock. That dock, each panel sits on a pontoon. We tied those pontoons together in rows, pushed those rows out one at a time, and built the next row behind it, tied them all together, and then floated them out in modules to tie together in the middle of the pond. That's pretty fun stuff. So here's what the finances look like around a 1 megawatt array. I want to talk to you about how the financials look in terms of a not-for-profit entity, and then I want to look at a for-profit entity because we're doing both. Coincidentally, 80% of the work that we do is for not-for-profit entities, for schools, for municipalities, for sewer authorities, for water authorities. We're doing for-profit businesses as well. So here's a proposal that we've got in front of the Weatherly School District at this point, kind of up in coal country, about an hour and a half northeast of here. Weatherly's a smaller school district. Weatherly's got the electricity requirement that would let us put a 1 megawatt array up and offset 100% of their electricity. When we deal with any not-for-profit or any for-profit business, the goal is always to try to offset 100% of their electricity if we can do that. So in this case, Weatherly School District is in the need for about a megawatt of power. That's about 2.5 acres of a solar array that we need to put up. We're going to put that up for the Weatherly School District. They're a not-for-profit, so they can't use that 26% federal tax credit that I told you about a couple of minutes ago. They can't use it, but investors who have federal tax liability can. So for a school district like this one, we're going to set up a special purpose entity that's going to be an entity that's set up using investors who have the federal tax liability. Those investors are going to purchase, install, operate, and maintain the system for an initial 5-year period, so they qualify for the 26% federal tax credit. They've got to hold for 5 years to qualify for the 26% federal tax credit. They're going to use that tax credit, 26%. They're also going to use accelerated depreciation. You can depreciate 85% of this system in year 1, even though you're getting a 26% federal tax credit for the system in the first place. So they're going to use accelerated depreciation and the federal tax credit. They're going to put up the array, maintain the array for 5 years, charge the school district a contract service payment for the array every year for 5 years. The school district in this case is going to save about save and make $25,000 a year for each of those 5 years. We encourage a not-for-profit to buy the system out after that initial 5-year period, because when you buy the system out and you own the system yourself, that's where the cash flow really is. Once the Weatherly School District buys this system out after 5 years, they can 100% finance, so they don't have to put any money in up front because the investors took care of them. They don't have to put any money out of pocket in after 5 years. They can 100% finance at that point. They're going to go from $25,000 a year savings to $90,000 a year savings, and that's at current solar renewable energy certificate values. If we can work with the legislature, get them to buck up and do what New Jersey's already done and go from a 0.5% solar generation to 5% solar generation, that's going to increase SREC values, and when the school district, in this case, is generating solar-generated electricity, they'll already have the federal tax incentive in place, that tax credit. When those SREC values go up, if they start to double or triple, which they could, the district's going to see significant additional cash flow. That's a smaller school district. So they're going to save about $3.3 million over a 40-year period. That's about the useful life of a solar array. We're doing other districts that are larger districts, like the Tamaqua School District, also up in coal country. The array that we're putting in Tamaqua is up Coal Street, they say, and then you make a left on Anthracite, and that's where the solar array is going to be. That stuff really fascinates me. That's Tamaqua, Pennsylvania. They've got a much larger system that they needed because they've got a much larger school district. So in this case, this was a 1 megawatt array. Tamaqua we're putting up a 2.5 megawatt array, 2.5 megawatt array for Tamaqua. That 2.5 megawatt array for Tamaqua School District is the same structure as this. So they've got no money in up front, no money in to buy the system out. They're going to save about $100,000 a year each year for the first 5 years after the investors put the array up. After they buy their system out, they're going to save about $210,000 a year. If their SREC values double, that's going to add about another $190,000 a year's worth of value to their system. They're going to save about $9 million over 40 years at current SREC values, that $9 million could go up into the $15, $16 million range, and that's for putting no money on the street. When Ray Kinder, their superintendent, first saw his cash flow analysis that I did for him when we were first investigating the project for him, and he looked at his numbers, I didn't say anything for about a minute. Ray didn't say anything, he just stared at the numbers, and he looked up over the top of the spreadsheet, and he said to me, that means I can do full-day kindergarten. And I said, Ray, you're my man. That's exactly the answer I wanted you to give me. Pretty cool stuff. So that's the way these things look for not-for-profit. So these are schools, these are colleges and universities, these are water authorities, sewer authorities. The city of Harrisburg is considering doing its own array to offset all of its electricity at this point. That's the kind of work that we do for non-profit entities. If you're a for-profit entity, I'm talking to Martin Guitar up in Nazareth, PA right now. Martin Guitar produces 80% of the acoustic guitars in the world. It's a great, they've got a museum, the whole 9 yards, great place to visit if you have an afternoon that you want to spend some time looking around. They're a for-profit entity. For a for-profit entity, they've got federal tax liability, so they can use that 26% federal tax credit. So what they're going to do, we encourage any for-profit entity that's going to do this to do a 25% leveraged investment. So if they're going to if they did put a 1 megawatt system up, theirs is a little different than that, but if they put a 1 megawatt system up, they put in a 25% leveraged investment, so their 1 megawatt system would cost them $1.8 million. Their 25% equity that they'd have to put in out of pocket is $450,000 for that 1 megawatt system. Because of that 26% federal tax credit and because of accelerated depreciation, the 85% year one accelerated depreciation, and because of electricity savings and because of SREC value, that $450,000 investment that they put in up front, they're going to get that back year one plus some, which is pretty cool. So they put $450 in up front, they get that $450 back within the first 12 months because of tax credits and electricity savings and SREC value. Once they've got that 100% return back year one, they're going to make about 11% on their money for the next 39 years. And for Chris Martin, who's an environmentalist anyway, if he can save the world, his little piece of the world, by putting this up as an environmentalist and make 11% on money that he's getting back year one, Chris Martin's a happy guy. That's the way that works. Here's a great quote from my good friend Thomas Edison. In 1931, Edison wrote to Henry Ford and said, I put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. And that was in 1931. That's unbelievable stuff. I want to go back to the slide that I showed earlier to close my conversation with you today. Barry, in his answer to the interviewer's question, said that if we did that with the environment, governments would listen to us. And I agree with him on that, but I wanted to extend his thought. Governments will listen to groups like Rotary because you're connected and you're influential and you're all over the world. But these answers require conversations with governments, but they also require action on the ground, talking to school districts, talking to businesses, talking to any kind of entity that can use clean energy. The deal is that clean energy doesn't require any sort of an altruistic investment on the part of the people who are going to put it up. You can save and make money on clean energy in 2020. There's a world out there to change. I've got grandkids. By the time my 10-year-old grandson is my age, I'm 62, he might be trying to live in a world that's kind of unlivable. And at this point, after I sold the business back in 2005, I've been trying to do whatever I can to try to head that off. You can change the world as a Rotary Club by spreading this kind of message. You can talk to governments, but you can spread this kind of message to all kinds of people that may be able to use this sort of thing. And that's exactly the power of a group like yours. It's great to see you today, and I really thank you for the opportunity. Josh says I've got a minute or two for a couple of questions.
There's technology, I might be somebody off base, but that actually could embed, like high-rise businesses, actually embed the solar cell in the glass. Is that true?
Yeah, it is. The question is, that Dick has heard that there's technology maybe available that could embed solar technology into glass so that high-rises could generate their own electricity. There are those technologies that are in play at this point. The efficiencies are not great yet. The cost balance doesn't quite work. When Matt introduced me, he mentioned that one of the things I'm doing is I'm the president of Celerity LLC. Celerity is a research and development company doing work on nanotech-based cells. There's a ton of work going on. Nanotechnology is the answer to really solving the solar problem. When you deal in nanotechnology, you manipulate materials at the atomic scale, at the scale of the wavelength of light that you're trying to capture and turn into electricity in the first place. So I've been working with a professor up at Penn State University Park for the last 12 years, who's a professor of nanotechnology, trying to develop a 2,000s thick, which is about half the thickness of a sheet of paper, 2,000s thick flexible cell that's got the efficiencies that we're talking about here at a fraction of the cost. And we are getting really interestingly close, but this is the kind of thing that nature's concealing really carefully. So I'm not sure when those new dramatic technologies are coming out. Every time I see one of those advertised, I look at the details, and it's a cost problem usually, that there are technologies that are kind of sort of workable, but it's just not there as a cost benefit yet, and that's why this stuff makes sense right now. Other questions?
All right. So speaking of cost, where is the cost borne for increasing SREC values? Does that wind up becoming, if Pennsylvania were to go from ½ cent to 5 cents,
yes,
does that wind up becoming a cost to taxpayers? In economic terms, where is the cost felt?
Yep. Great question. I think everyone could hear that question. So the cost is borne by the utilities who are going to pass that cost on to ratepayers. But the fact of the matter is that clean energy, solar and wind now, are cheaper ways to produce new energy than any other fossil fuel-based source. So there is an initial cost to taxpayers, or to ratepayers more than taxpayers, for that jump from ½ % to 5%. But in the meanwhile, Pennsylvania as a Commonwealth is going to be generating or developing an energy infrastructure that's less expensive than our current means of doing that. So there's some upfront cost there, and everyone always, I'll get challenges when I speak fairly frequently. Why should I put taxpayer money into renewable energy systems when I've got pretty cheap energy that's already available and I don't have to pay anything subsidies-wise for that? The answer is, yeah, you do. Yeah, the fossil fuel industry's been around. It won the game 125 years ago, and there's all kinds of subsidies that are still funneled into some of the most profitable companies on the planet. If I had fossil fuel subsidies drop to zero and renewable solar and wind subsidies drop to zero, I'll compete with fossil fuels all day long if you take those subsidies away. So basically, ratepayers will pay a shorter term premium for a longer term energy infrastructure that makes more sense. That's the answer to that question, absolutely.
What is the solar degree efficiency in central Pennsylvania?
Yep, in central PA, so the solar cells themselves have a standard efficiency. It's in the 19% conversion efficiency range. So the amount of energy that's hitting a panel versus the amount of electricity that's producing is about 19%. So that's the case no matter where you are. Then you have to look at how many solar hours you've got in a day. In our area, it's 3.3 hours in a day, average over the course of a whole year. If you're in Las Vegas, Nevada, the one slide that I showed you, Las Vegas and Hawaii are the two sunniest places in the US. You're at 6 hours a day instead of 3.3. So 19% efficiency, and then it depends on where you're located geographically in terms of how much your system will produce. But more importantly, it depends on where you're located politically in terms of whether you can afford to do it or not. If you move just to the east side of the Delaware River into New Jersey, you can do just about anything. And New Jersey's about 35% renewably powered now versus Pennsylvania that's still in the less than 1%. Big difference. Go ahead.
Yeah, what are the O&M costs associated with solar, and what is the anticipated life of one of these arrays?
Great questions. Let's start with the second question. The anticipated life of an array is 40 years. They actually last 40 to 50 years. The technology's been out since 1954 and fundamentally hasn't changed since 54. It's gotten cheaper, it's gotten denser, but it's the same technology. There are solar cells working that have been working for 50 years. We typically do cash flow analysis on a 40-year basis. The panels themselves have a 30-year power production warranty to them. I told you that early in the conversation, that the panels don't have any moving parts to them, so they're very, very reliable. All of the Tier 1 supplier panels, we only use Tier 1 supplier panels, they all come with a 30-year power production warranty. If any time within that 30-year period you don't get 80% of the rated value or the rated output of those panels, over a 30-year period, the manufacturer will replace those panels free of charge. So very reliable, just works.
O&M costs?
Oh, sorry, O&M cost. The O&M cost we build in, it's pretty light duty stuff. There are no moving parts to a solar array, so O&M costs are very, very small relative to the value of the array. For school districts or not-for-profits, the numbers that I showed you, the cash flow numbers for the Tamaka School District, the $100,000 a year and the $200,000 a year after they buy out, O&M is included in that, and it's a minor fraction of that. O&M might be $20,000 or $30,000 a year out of there. It's a part of the net when you get to their $100,000 or $200,000 a year savings. Pretty reasonable, sure.
Two practical questions.
Yes, sir.
When you put one of those arrays on the roof of an existing building, do you have to reinforce the roof at all?
Don't. Usually you don't. The question is, when you put arrays on the roof, do you have to reinforce the roof at all? You really don't worry as much about the weight of the panels. You're dealing with about 4 pounds per square foot over the area of the array. You worry more about the wind blowing the panels off of the roof. So these systems are designed so that they're ballasted onto the roof, and they lay down at about a 10-degree angle. They used to sit at a higher angle, and the industry figured out that if you sit them at a higher angle, you'll produce a little more electricity per panel. But if you lay them, but that row shadows the next row, so you have to move the row back further because the row in front of it shadows it. The industry realized that if you lay these things down at 10 degrees instead of 30 or 35 degrees, the wind doesn't get under them as much, and you can push them closer together because now at 10 degrees I'm not shadowing as much. So they're rated for wind, and you worry more about wind than you worry about weight.
Second
question
is
that there's no roof penetrations when you do a roof array. They sit on the roof, they don't get screwed down to the roof, so you're not screwing through your roof membrane.
Second question is, you said in Las Vegas, I guess it was,
Yep.
you're picking up, absorbing from both sides of the, how do you do that on the underside?
It's pretty cool. So we're actually, all of the panels that we're using now, we are, we just purchased about 20 megawatts worth of panels for the end of the year purchase. So we've got a container load of panels coming in from the Far East in the next month or so. These are bifacial panels. It's called a bifacial panel. They absorb sunlight from the top and the bottom of the panel. They're about 30% more productive than a monofacial panel, which only absorbs sunlight from the top.
Where does the sun come from?
It's scattered around. So there's light that's scattering around everywhere. It doesn't have to impinge directly on the panel. All that ambient light that's floating around and scattering is the light that it's picking up, and it produces it. The technology's pretty cool. So those are all the incremental advances in the technology, short of finding the revolutionary nanotech development. That's where the industry's going. Great question. Other questions?
One more.
Yes.
Regular, yeah.
Question. What does this do to the economics of continuing to operate existing nuclear power plants and getting rid of the waste fuel and all of those things that are attached to nuclear?
Absolutely. So you've seen the news. I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, right?
Yep.
3 Mile Island is about 10 minutes away. I'm really, and I started school as a nuclear engineer and changed. 3 Mile Island happened in my sophomore year, and I had seniors who were graduating from Georgia Tech with degrees in nuclear engineering and going to school for the grad school for mechanical engineering because they couldn't find a job. And I thought to myself, we need to get out of nuclear engineering. Nuclear is a tougher and tougher and tougher business. Nuclear, TMI is shutting down, right? Other nuclear plants are going to start to shut down. There was a significant legislative initiative, a lobbying initiative to try to bail out TMI and bail out other plants. I don't see the political energy to be, no pun intended, political energy to be able to do that. Nuclear is going to get tougher and tougher. Now, what that means is that when you drop a TMI out, that's got a lot of generating capacity. When you drop other nuclear plants out that have their own generating capacity, there's a gap that's created, and we've got to start to fill that gap if we're going to be conscious and intentional about this as a society. Fill that gap with renewables if we're going to do our job right. So one of the things that we're trying to push is legislation in Pennsylvania and elsewhere that's going to set the game, set the stage, not a game, it's serious, dead serious, set the stage for more renewable generation to be able to backfill the gap that's going to be left by the nuclear industry.
But that capacity of renewable is going to be built for the purpose of supplying specific needs. But I guess that's what you're talking about, yeah.
Well, it is. So there's the bit that nuclear, the solar is, what I've been talking about today is doing solar arrays, creating generating plants for individual specific needs. There are ways to do this on much, much larger scale. That's called utility grade solar or utility scale solar, where Penn State just did a 500-acre array to do about 25% of their electricity. They went into, I think it was Franklin County, 500 acres of ground, and put up a 500-acre array for their specific purpose. You could do larger arrays than that yet and do them as utility scale arrays so that you would just tie them directly to the grid and let them sit there like you'd have a coal plant or a gas plant or a nuclear plant or any other kind of a plant sit there. And solar, because of the kinds of things that I've been talking to you about today, is a cheaper way to build new energy capacity than nuclear or gas or coal or any other source. There's the bit. So we've got the technology to be able to fix the problem at this point, the global problem at this point. Our problem is not technology lack, our problem is political will. And we really are in the energy wars.
So then all of the worry about getting rid of the nuclear fuel waste that we were all worried about
exactly.
10, 15 years ago is
well, so there's one of the problems with nuclear. So the question was, do you worry about getting rid of nuclear waste from nuclear plants? Yeah, you do, especially in the age of terrorism. Pennsylvania sent me over to the Rhône-Alpes region of France about 7 or 8 years ago as Pennsylvania's representative. They did a sustainability conference over there, and Pennsylvania has an agreement with the Rhône-Alpes region of France on different issues, sustainability among them. What France wanted to talk about when I got over there 7 years ago was that they made the decision in the 60s to go nuclear. So France is still about 70% powered by nuclear energy, and France is a key terrorism target. And they've recognized that with the advent of the internet, where you can hack into plants without having to attack them physically, and with the advent of terrorism, neither one of which were contemplated in the 60s when they did their nuclear infrastructure, they've now got this whole assembly of nuclear bombs that they've conveniently located for a terrorist organization all over the country of France. They have committed themselves to retool their power infrastructure. They don't like the nuclear waste issues either, which they're actively dealing with. They don't want to retool to fossil fuels because Europe is way more environmentally conscious than the US is, which drives me crazy because we're better than that. But France didn't want to retool with fossil fuels. Their only option then, when they look at trying to get rid of 70% of nuclear infrastructure, is to go renewables. And that's what they wanted to talk about, and that's what they're actively moving toward now. We live in interesting times. We really do.